What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon 466 Cards, and today we're going to talk about inflation and the impact on the sports cards market. As some of you know, I have a master's degree in economics, so I'd like to think I know what I'm talking about. And this video is going to talk about inflation in a different way than what you're used to hearing. Normally, you hear about how rising costs due to inflation is a bad thing. It's going to reduce the amount of money you're able to spend on discretionary items like sports cards because you need to spend more of your income on the essentials, right? Gas, food, rent, or mortgage payments, etc., etc., etc. And so as a result, there's less money to be spent on sports cards. I'm here to tell you that that's partially the case in the short term, but not the case in the long term. And I'll explain why. So you can see here, inflation is at roughly 4%, 5.3% if you look at core inflation, but in that 4 to 5% range, right? And so obviously last year in 2022, it reached in that 8% range. It was a lot. But I want to take a step back and think about things from a bigger picture perspective, not just stay so caught in the moment in terms of what cost inflation is and what the long-term adjustments are going to be in the marketplace in terms of the labor market and also in terms of income. And I have a bunch of data from the Department of Labor where we'll talk about this. But before we do that, I'm going to build 3 different archetypes for you, all right, to understand the impact of inflation. And these 3 different archetypes will have different types of incomes, and we're going to examine how those people are impacted. So we have example number 1 here. We have a person who after tax income is $35,000. You can see here, and their essentials, the money they spend money on, is $25,000, which is in red. So you can see here, before inflation, this person earned $35,000. $25,000 in the red is the essentials, which leaves $10,000 for discretionary income or expenses. With 10% inflation, which is a pretty big number that we've seen in the last couple of years, and you can adjust these numbers a little bit up, a little bit down. The same thought process is going to hold. If inflation on that person's essentials causes their cost to go up by 10% because of 10% inflation, now they're left with, instead of $10,000 in discretionary income, they only have $7,500, right? Because this has gone up by $2,500, so this has to go down by $2,500, right? And so as a result, even though inflation has gone up by 10%, this person's discretionary income has actually decreased by 25%. You can see that here, right? It went from 10 grand to $7,500, so 25% increase or decrease. Now let's look at someone who's a little bit more well off. He's a little bit blessed. You can see from the emoji I'm using here, right? Same before and after 10% inflation, but this person has after-tax income of $75,000 and his costs or his essentials cost $35,000. Maybe he has a little bit of a nicer car, a little bit of a nicer home, whatever it may be, right? So as a result, he has more discretionary income, even though his costs for his essentials, food, clothing, housing, are a little bit higher. So it goes from 35 grand for cost to 38.5, right? So 10% inflation. As a result, his discretionary income goes down by $3,500. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a lot less of his discretionary income. It's now only 9%. So someone in this kind of middle tax bracket, he's got an impact on his discretionary income, but it's not as major as this guy. Even though the raw dollar amount is higher, the percentage impact is a lot lower. And now let's talk about our whale. He's got after-tax income of 150 grand. He enjoys nice things, so he spends 60 of it on food, clothing, housing, all that kind of stuff. 10% inflation, sure, his discretionary income went down the most from $90,000 to $84,000, but from a percentage perspective, it's only 7%, right? And this goes on through and through. And this whale basically barely feels inflation. He's still got tons of money to spend. Now, we've only talked about costs. And that is the main focus of discussion when talking about inflation. But the one thing people almost never talk about when they talk about the impact of inflation, because they're focusing on the short term, is the long-term impact of inflation on wages. But here's an important economics lesson. Wages and salaries generally increase to match inflation in the long run. In the short term, it does not, right? We've seen that in the last 2 years. But in the long term, they more or less net out to being equal. And so what I have from you, what I have on this page is something from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. It breaks down inflation adjusted incomes, right? So it's accounting for inflation. How much money are you actually earning? And break it down by the different percentiles. And you can see these are basically flat lines. For the lower income folks, right? People at the 10th percentile of income, it's a flat line. 25th percentile, it's a flat line. This is over 20 years, basically. Get down to the median, and it's a flat line, but there's a slight increase in the amount of inflation-adjusted income. But you get to the 75th percentile and the 90th percentile, these show that generally people in the top half of income earners actually have their incomes grow faster than inflation, right? A flat line means you're growing with inflation. An increasing line means you're growing faster than inflation. So everybody in the long run, again, there's obviously dips and increases as things change, but generally your wages should grow on average, right? It's obviously different, not the case person to person, but as a whole, as a society, they're basically flat with inflation. But as you move higher in the income brackets, you actually outpace inflation with your wages. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it. Just trust me, like this is 20 years of history here. There's models, economic models that explain this, but all the talk that you hear when you talk about inflation is it's feared, right? Because it's an increase in the amount of money you need to spend to buy stuff. But salaries and incomes also generally match inflation in the long run. And we actually have proof of that, right? So here we have on this page again, remember 4% inflation or maybe 5% inflation. This is again July of 2023. That's on inflation costs. But if we look at some other articles, well, here's an article from April 2023, Washington Post. Wages and salaries rose 5% from a year ago. So we're at 5% wage inflation, which more or less matches this 4 to 5% cost inflation. And so we're doing the thing I just talked about, how inflation in cost is generally matched by inflation in income and wages, right? Here's something, and so this article, this was from April 28, 2023. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor. If we scroll down, and this is July 7th, right? So pretty recent. If we scroll down here, where is it? In June, so June 2023, average hourly earnings for all employees on private non-farm payrolls rose by 12 cents or 0.4% to $33.58. Over the past 12 months, average hourly earnings have increased by 4.4%. Well, that's more or less the exact rate of inflation, right? You recall this one where inflation here, as of July 10th, it's, in May it was 4%. For some other measures, it's 5.3%. But 4.4%, it's more or less in line with inflation. So wage inflation is never talked about, but it's matching cost inflation pretty closely. And then lastly, this is from Canada. This is talking about incomes and comparing household purchasing power at different income levels since 2019 to, you can see this report is from June of 2023. If we scroll down to the end here, they make a very interesting point. In the fourth quarter of 2022, households at all quintiles, so they've separated incomes into 5 quintiles, basically, by each 20 percentiles. They say that compared with before the pandemic, the same initial basket of goods dropped in terms of how much disposable income was needed to use. So it's actually, you can buy more with the amount of money you have. And over this period, again, comparing fourth quarter of 2022 to before the pandemic, wage increases alone outpaced the rate of inflation for households in the three highest income quintiles. So basically, that's exactly what I was saying earlier. People in the top half, roughly, of incomes as a whole, their wage increases have outpaced the rate of inflation, which is, going back to this, what we see here. What I just showed you was talking about Canada pre-pandemic to 2022. This is looking at 20 years of history, and it's saying the same thing, right? This is not out of line with what the US is seeing. And so that is the point here, is that wage inflation needs to be part of the discussion when talking about inflation. It's not just about costs, because in the long run, everything is fine. In the short run, there's some pain, but you're already seeing that we're reaching a new equilibrium in terms of incomes. So what does that mean? So let's go back to our first example, our first guy. After inflation, we saw the decrease in discretionary income, but after the 10% salary increase, he now has, instead of $10,000 in discretionary income, he now has $11,000 in discretionary income. However, for people in this range, or who have this income situation, it really ultimately doesn't matter, because if you only have this small of amount of money to spend on discretionary income, chances are you're not buying sports cards. And if you are, you're buying lower cost ones. You're not buying a $500 card, right? And so sports cards are a discretionary cash outlay. A little typo there. Shout out to Jeremy Lee for that correction. And people who don't have a lot of discretionary incomes are unlikely to have funds to really impact the sports cards market, right? So this group of people isn't likely to be in the hobby. But if we move on to the next group, we're now in the hashtag blessed category. You can see here, before inflation, we talked about the impact, but now their salary has increased by 10%. And so now they have 10% more discretionary income, from 40 grand to 44 grand. But we've just seen from the data I showed you that if you're in the mid to upper mid income bracket, your salary is going to increase faster than inflation. You're probably maybe looking at a 13% salary increase in a 10% inflation world. So as a result, your discretionary income has actually increased by 16%. From $40,000 to $46,500 after we do all of these machinations and calculations here. And that's the part that's missing from all these discussions about inflation in the hobby, about sports cards. These type of people are the people that are actually going to benefit from inflation, because we're going to have way more, well, not way more, but noticeably more income in the long run. And that will drive more demand in discretionary items like sports cards, and ultimately that leads to higher prices. And then we go to our whales. Again, the 10% we talked about, but now their salary is going to increase by 10%, might even increase by 15%, because as you recall, people in the highest income brackets, they're going to come out the best, right? They're going to have their incomes, again, on average, increase by more than the rate of inflation. And so if inflation is 10%, they're going at 15%, maybe 20%, maybe even more, right? There are these whales that make a ton of money that already had way more money than they need than almost all people, and now they're going to have even more money to spend on discretionary items. They're not impacted by inflation at all, and in the long run, it's actually going to benefit them, because they're going to have more money to spend. So it's a saying for a reason, like the rich get richer. And this is basically what inflation is going to do. And that means whales are just going to have more money to fight amongst each other for these grails, these massive, massive cards. So that's why, to me, inflation is going to really drive high-end sports cards further in the next few years. And so that's why I'm saying inflation is a net positive for high-end sports card prices, not a net negative. And that's the entire video. So does what I'm saying make sense? I talked about this on my IG at Simon466cards about 10 months ago and in September. I'm just rehashing some of the stuff here, but now I have new data from 2023 that supports a lot of what I was saying 9-10 months ago. So that's it. That's a video. Would love to hear your comments on this one, because this is obviously something that's not talked about at all in the hobby. Do you agree with what I'm showing and what I'm saying? Do you think I'm full of crap? Which hopefully you don't. And more importantly, what are your thoughts? Would love to hear that in the comments below. So thank you as always for watching and listening, and I will talk to you all soon. Cheers.